Welcome, everyone, to a new seminar of the Exiting Violence series. Today, we will talk about exiting violence, thinking through Asian perspectives. My name is Deborah Tonelli, Georgetown University representative in Rome. To introduce today's conversation, I will just say a few words about the book and the series of meetings in person and or online like today, inspired by this work after its publication last year. The aim of the Exiting Violence series is to discuss some of the topics covered in the book Exiting Violence, The Role of Religion, published by the Georgetown in 2024 and edited by me and by my friend and colleague Gerard Mannion. Sadly, Gerard passed away before its publication. This book is one of the outcomes of our research project on the dynamics between religion and violence, supported by the Center for Religious Studies at Bruno Kessler Foundation in Trento, Reset Dialogue of Civilization, and the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace and World Affairs at Georgetown University. Gerard and I have always believed that just as a religion can play a role in conflicts, it can also help to end violence. In developing this project, Gerard and I realized that an interdisciplinary, interreligious, and intercultural approach was necessary. To achieve this, we involved the scholars from different continents, engaged in the study of diverse religious traditions. The problems and dynamics often seemed similar, that is, the risk of instrumentalization of religion, but also the role of social pacification that it can play. However, we could not succumb to the temptation of generalizations, because only in the characteristic of context and cultures was it possible to grasp those aspects that allow different faith traditions to contribute to the construction of social peace. This contextual approach, the possibility of immersing oneself in the history and tradition of other cultures, is truly important today, because it teaches us not to use our own criteria to understand what is different from us, and encourages us to seek points of encounter and dialogue. The real challenge is not understanding, but rather inhabiting the disorientation and the uncertainty that the encounter with cultures and traditions different from our own provokes in us. It is about knowing how to live with and accompany the change that the encounter between East and West brings about in each other, recognizing that from this encounter, each person emerges somewhat different from how they were before. Following the publication of the book, this series of meetings on exiting violence is a way to navigate this uncertainty, to stimulate creativity, and to reflect on how faith traditions address the dynamics of violence. What I have learned from my studies of the biblical tradition is that sacred texts and ancient traditions do not provide answers to our problems, but offer us tools to formulate our questions, to learn to recognize criteria, values, teachings, and the life practice that can help us develop our answers in a way that is consistent with what we believe. Some videos of previous meetings are posted on the website of Georgetown University Rome office in the section Initiatives. But now, together with you, I will listen to our guest, and it is with a great pleasure that I now give the floor to Father Albert Aleio. He is a professor in the Faculty of Social Science at the Gregorian University Collegium Maximum. He is a poet, priest, professor, and peace activist that is engaged in social research, indigenous peoples' rights advocacy, human rights promotion, poetic translations, spiritual retreats, fighting corruption, and integrity workshops. Thank you, Father Albert. The floor is yours.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation. So first of all, I'd like to congratulate the editors and the authors of this great book, Exiting Violence. What many people will wonder, can we really exit violence? Exit violence into peace, but where is peace? And how is religion involved in both the conflict as well as in the search for peace? So this afternoon, we have three of the authors in this collection of essays, and we're very fortunate to have with us three thinkers and practitioners, peace advocates, and their presentations will not be very easy. Facing squarely what violence is and what's the context of violence, and sometimes we're left with questions, but we're not hopeless, and we are in search for harmony and peace. And I believe very sincerely that our presentation today will help us formulate our questions and probably lead us to our own location in finding harmony and peace. So the first speaker, our first speaker would be a brother Jesuit, Reverend Vincent Sekar. He's a Jesuit and a priest scholar in Jain philosophy and religion. He has an MPhil and a PhD from the University of Madras, Chennai. I've been there, Father. He is currently Associate Professor in the Department of Philosophy, Head of the Department of Human Excellence, and Director of Campus Ministry at Arul Anandar College in Tamil Nadu, India. He was Secretary for the Commission for Interreligious Dialogue in the Jesuit Conference of South Asia, and he remains an occasional consultant to the Vatican Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue on Jain Christian dialogue. I met him in Rome, and Father Vincent, you have 10 minutes. I'll introduce the others more in detail, Ian Reader and Louis Comjati later. Father Vincent.
Thank you. Thank you, Albert. I'm really happy to see you all listening to me from India and from Indian experiences that I would like to share with you some perspectives. You know, human mind is always connected to the environment, and it is the environment that shapes our human mind. If you go into human psychology and especially the personality development, it is the family and the environment and what you learned and others, the sources, these are the ones actually to shape us. Theology also is shaped by context, by circumstances. I totally believe in that because that is what we have experienced in India, particularly in South India. There had been several theological methods that we have used depending upon the context, depending upon the circumstances. So that is how I really feel that we have many theologies. Liberation theology is there, process theology is there, green theology is there, black theology, and so on. We can always say many things. So I personally believe that it is the context and the environment that shapes us all. No, I would say, and I would like to go back to 16th, 17th centuries in India, when the great Mughal emperor actually invited the Jesuits to his palace for two jobs. One is actually to present Catholicism to the varied scholars and audience, particularly, Brahmins and other scholars. So they were all there, actually, Jains, Buddhists, and several others. He was interested, actually, to find whether there will be a possibility of a syncretic theology or a syncretic religion. That's what he was interested. So Jesuits grabbed that opportunity, actually, grabbed that circumstance, grabbed that context, went there, and then they lived in his palace for nearly 20 years, 2 decades. Particularly Father Geronimo Xavier, he was living there for 2 decades. But initially, those people who came there, actually, they left because of certain disappointment that they were not able to convert the Emperor Akbar. But the thing is, they presented the Renaissance art. That is, Renaissance art is actually the human emotions and the human appearance. Everything is shown very realistically, emotionally. So they showed all these pictures and actually grabbed the attention of Emperor Akbar, and not only Akbar, his own son, Jahangir, and then later on other sons also. But the thing is, this Renaissance arts shared by the European Jesuits actually is simply tampered the imagination of not only Akbar and his court, but also the Mughal artists. So they grabbed that. They actually incorporated all these things into their own art, in their own artist skills, very quickly mastered. Then afterwards, when Akbar asked the Jesuits to give a book in Arabic, in Persian, actually, it is the Mughal artists, they helped actually these Jesuits actually to paint, say, things like Virgin and Child, the several events of the Bible, of the Gospels. And then they presented, especially Geronimo presented 2 copies. One was to Akbar and the other was to Jahangir. Why 2 copies? Because Akbar got one nice copy with the lesser number of pictures, whereas his son, Jahangir, was very interested in art and aesthetics. So he wanted more pictures, and then you have a kind of a 364 pictures in that particular book, which he gave. It's a Life of Christ in Persian. That was the first book actually written. And that is how actually a dialogue came to be or got initiated, not only because of the debates, but also because of the use of arts, the role of arts and aesthetics played in Muslim as well as in Christianism. And later on, in 17th and 18th centuries, there were several others actually who came. Italian missionaries, Portuguese missionaries, they came there, all of them Jesuits, because I am just restricting to Jesuit history. These people, they came, actually adapted themselves. That was a kind of another theological method that they followed. Adapted their lifestyle, adapted their thinking according to the context and the circumstances the people were living there or experiencing. So they saw the ecclesiastical authors, the ecclesiastical Hindu ecclesiastical clerics and all those things. And he, especially Robert de Nobili. De Nobili is very much remembered here because of adaptation, for his adaptive method actually in the process of evangelization. So he partly succeeded. Not only succeeded, actually he initiated another establishment called the Pandaraswami, who were actually, they were not only able to actually mingle with or mix with the high caste people as well as the low caste peoples. But the evangelization process was very, very alive. And following this, there was a kind of an ashram style of life that emerged. Ashram is the place where you relax. Ashrama. that is in Sanskrit, that is, there's no burdens. So there is a kind of a easy relaxation. So ashram way of life is a Christian ashram is something very, very new. But the thing is modeled on the hundreds and thousands of ashrams in India, Hindu ashrams. There, actually, not only the tools like language, rituals, worship, devotion, singing practices, and all those things very, very changed. You know, it simply had an impact in Tamil church, Tamil Christian church, Tamil Catholic church. So you find after this that there were several temples looking like Hindu temples. You go there inside, that all the rituals and the way they perform things like that, the singing of bhajans particularly, they're all modeled on kind of a Hindu style. But the thing is, there was really criticism on these things because these ashram people, they were following a kind of a high caste, high class, Brahminic lifestyle or Brahminic tools for rituals, performance, things like that. And the third method was emerging from all these things, especially people wanted, especially the formation clerics and religious, they saw the things, particularly the Jesuits in Tamil Nadu provinces. They saw that we need to do theology or do the formation in mission. In mission. That is, you go and live with the people, be with them, and then share with their food, be a kind of a simple lifestyle. So it looked like actually it became like a regionalization of theology. So in many places in the regional theology, but some of them are closed now. But the thing is, ours are more than 35 years now in Madurai province, in Tamil Nadu province. That is, they teach in Tamil, they teach the Tamil culture, and then theologize the good and bad times of people, especially joining them, participating in their celebrations, in their good timings and all those things. And at the same time, in the bad times, like injustice, poverty, discrimination, things like that. So this method was, and even now, it is actually so helpful that people think that clerics, the religious, because of their formation, actually they are closer to the people. So it was like that. And now the last thing is the present times and the contemporary times. Actually, you cannot say contemporary in the sense of last 40 years or so. There has been a kind of awakening of Hindu militant thinking, militant ideology, Hindu nationalism, which means actually India is meant only for the Hindus, not for the others, which means all others, they have to comply with the way these people are, you know, is a kind of a religious fundamentalist thinking. But you know, even the central government actually is the leaders from them are coming from this kind of ideological background. So you can see that, you know, there are so much of hatred and the kind of antagonism being prepared, and then against especially the minorities, minority Muslims, minority Christians. So you have, this is the kind of a contemporary context in which a theological method of accelerating the social dialogue. Accelerating social dialogue, and also religious communities, meeting with the religious communities, talking to them, liaising with the people like that. So you find at the same time, you know, especially when strife, conflicts, burning of churches or the scriptures or things like that, if that happens, there are actually civic bodies who actually take enough and more active steps actually to prepare a commission, then give memorandum, and so many other activities are there, including the Catholic and Christian institutions also. Sometimes they close down the schools and the colleges and all those things in protest. They also pray. So those things are there actually. So it is not easy actually to stand against fundamentalist ideology when it is actually very, very prominent, especially. These are some of the theological methods actually that has been helping for people in Christianity, in Christian church, in I wouldn't say in exiting violence, because I have a real question in that, because we cannot exit violence because it's a part of the CK. It's part of the CK of a person, individual, group, CK. So when there is a group mob and a group activity, you really have no control of all those things, anger, hatred, and all those things. So it's also been paid by people. So you also see a kind of coolie like that, no? So you see, you cannot exit violence, but the thing is, you can dilute the antagonism. Not only dilute antagonism and conflicts, people try to understand in the apartments. People understand within the neighborhood, small neighborhood. So there are smaller groups actually to help in these processes and all those things. So dilute antagonism, reduce conflicts, and the more positively and proactively you engage in dialogue with people, you show certain goodwill and create a kind of a space so that people are with you and you are with them. So this is the thing that I can explain in the beginning, in probably the first round of talk, and then afterwards we shall see. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That can only come from a man of wisdom and experience, and probably a man of several wounds from experience. Now, thank you, Vincent, for contextualizing the meaning of context and deriving from there some insights on how to go about mission and even theologizing. So thank you very much. We'll get back to you with questions, right? All right. Yeah. Now, our next presenter is Professor Ian Reader, Professor Emeritus. When will I be emeritus? In Japanese Studies at the University of Manchester. He was previously Professor of Religious Studies at Lancaster University, England, and he has also held academic positions in, take note, Japan, Scotland, the United States, and Denmark. Maybe it's not too late to go to the Philippines, where I come from. His main research areas include the study of pilgrimage across cultures. Also, of interest to him would be contemporary religious practices in Japan and studies of religion and violence. Professor Ian Reader, please share with us your wisdom from all this research and experiences.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, I was just talked about how people come together and, you know, in discussions and dialogues kind of join in kind of very positive ways. I'm going to talk a little bit about how a religious groups can sometimes, by looking at other religious groups as well, draw on, you know, similar ideas across them in rather negative ways, but also link up to what he said about the idea of the rising tide of fundamentalism in India, which I'm well aware of, and how that provides kind of divisions and others people and creates polarizations which can be highly critical. My engagement with the topic of religion and violence came about in actually a very practical way, in that, being a specialist on religion in contemporary Japan, in 1995, probably everybody's aware that the Tokyo subway attack happened, and it transpired it was a religious group called Om Shinrikyo that was behind it. People started asking me what was going on here, and I felt I had to really study it. And I then spent the next 5 years immersed in studying, getting all the interviewing members of that movement, attending when people were arrested, attending their trials, reading all the trials transcripts, reading the police reports, and getting hold of their sacred texts. And it was actually while reading the texts that I got the clues as to how their progress, because Aum Shinrikyo started as a peaceful millennial yoga and meditation type group that believed it could transform the world spiritually. And it had some direct and very valid criticisms of the world as being overly secular, materialistic, and damaging to the environment, and so on. And how it transformed into being violent became very clear as I went through both its history and also looked at what it was saying. And it raised that big question for me in terms of religious texts, you know, looking at religious texts, not just in Japan, but across the board. And the striking thing with Aum Shinrikyo was that not only did they develop their own structures, they were predominantly Buddhist in orientation, but they read very widely and they saw the same themes being articulated in religious texts across multiple traditions, from the Bible to Buddhist texts of different sorts and so on. And I became kind of interested in this idea of texts that sanctify or appear to sanctify violence and division, and raise issues about defending one's faith. And it kind of raised question for me, like, you know, if, you know, questions like, is a faith, is a religious traditional creed worth defending if it requires violence to defend it? There were many things. I mean, Aum was very different from mainstream Japanese society, and it faced a lot of opprobrium. And recently in email dialogue, Deborah and I, we raised the issue of when people get mocked for their beliefs. And there was certainly a factor that in secular society, they were seen as outliers who were very heavily critiqued by the people in the country, in Japan. And that raises questions about how much the prevailing secularizing dynamics of society in themselves create polarizations which actually can cause religious groups to become more violent. And I've seen that pattern because after looking at Aum, I worked on a number of other movements in different parts of the world, and I saw so many similarities. What was very striking to me about Aum Shinrikyo was, as it became more alienated from society, its millennial orientations moved from being on, and the idea of a spiritual conflict to eradicate evil in the world transformed into a more practical type of thing where they had to physically confront forces opposing them. And this was the spiritual struggle then becomes a physical struggle. And that theme becomes increasingly articulated in the sermons, the teachings, which become the sacred texts of their leader. And what's interesting is, as those ideas become stronger and stronger within the movement, they start to they see similar parallels, whether it's in certain Buddhist texts that appear to legitimate violence in certain contexts, whether it's in the Book of Revelations, or in all sorts of other reasons. So what I actually was seeing was that this isn't a Japanese case so much as a representative of how violence can erupt within a religious context and be apparently legitimated. And it raises that question about how do people deal with the apparent idea of violence that is articulated sometimes in religious texts. And interestingly, although my chapter comes, I think, third in the book, I was looking also at you might have to correct my Italian pronunciation here, Deborah, but is it Enzo Pace's chapter on Sri Lankan Buddhism? Have I got that one right? That followed mine, and in a very, very real way, some aspects of what he wrote resonated with what I've written, because, you know, he's talking about how Sri Lanka, certain Sri Lankan Buddhist movements utilized a kind of polarizing and othering to what really belongs in Sri Lanka. Very similar, I think, to Hindutva in India, in a sense. You know, if you're Sri Lankan, you are Buddhist. You're not Tamil, you're not Hindu. And there is a kind of an othering process, a dividing process. And I saw that type of polarization emerging in Om Shinrikyo, and I've seen it emerging in many other groups. What's striking there is how the other then becomes associated with the idea of evil that must be eradicated. The embodiment of evil on earth is that which does not fit with that particular religious dialogue, that particular religious perspective. And the other thing that was very striking to me there was in his chapter was how he showed how Sri Lankan Buddhists who were looking, in a sense, looking for a legitimation for what they were saying, were able to find it within the Buddhist scriptures that they saw as sacred. And he points out that, you know, religious groups, if they want to find a legitimation for, if you like, discrimination, othering, and so on, are usually able to find it within the text of their tradition. And he points out this particular text in, which I believe I also cite in my chapter, that legitimates this type of violence and othering in the Buddhist, in the Sri Lankan case of Tamils. And the thing that concerns me, has concerned me totally within the whole process, you know, one can see this process of polarizing and otherizing and legitimating of one's own rights, not just in religious spheres, of course, but also in political spheres and so on. But from my, you know, from the position I have as formerly as professor of religious studies and who spent most of his academic life studying religions, is how is it that religions that purportedly seek truth and peace and so on, and say they represent deity or spiritual forces that are good, how do they deal with the presence of violent images and themes in the texts that they often hold sacred? Or how do they deal with the figures of their religious traditions that appear at certain times to behave in rather non-spiritually peaceful ways? And I'm thinking of whether it's the God of the Old Testament or, you know, Buddhist texts where Zen Buddhist texts where Zen masters act violently against their disciples for various reasons, or when those texts polarize the world between the ideas of truth and falsity. And of course, if I could sit here for hours giving you examples of texts and religious groups that have, you know, texts that have got intrinsic themes of violence, and of religious groups that have used those. Sadly, I feel I can't spend as long, I don't have as many examples of religious leaders who have very explicitly denounced the text within their traditions that appear to legitimate violence. And I think that is a real problem. And I think until that issue is dealt with, we're going to have serious, I mean, I agree in a way with Father Secco that exiting violence is a wonderful ideal, which will not happen, but we have to try and address that and try and go towards it. And until those issues about the violence in text or the legitimation of violence in text is properly addressed, I think we have a problem. And I will leave it there.
Wow, thank you very much. You didn't even consume the 10 minutes given to you. But anyway, that gives us more time for discussion, and you can add other examples in the process. So thank you, Sir Ian. You started with Japan, but you actually cover much more than that. And you did not just stop at the empirical study, but you're actually opening the discussion for theorizing on text and religious text and political violence. Now, our third and last presenter actually appears first in the list of articles in this wonderful book. I keep on presenting this lest we forget. It's also promotion. Sir Louis Comjati, is that the correct pronunciation? Is the director or Chongchuan Chair and distinguished scholar in residence at the Center for Taoist Studies, the Education and Research branch of the Taoist Foundation. He is also senior translator and editor-in-chief of the Taoist Translation Committee. He is the founding co-chair and the principal architect of both the Taoist Studies Unit and Contemplative Studies Unit of the American Academy of Religion. A leading international Taoist scholar, practitioner, and translator of Taoist literature. Oh, imagine this. He has published 14 books and some 30 academic articles and book chapters, including translations of 40 Taoist texts to date. I think your contribution here, Sir Louis, is not just on conflict itself, but precisely on the visions of peace, of great peace, coming from the Chinese Taoist religious traditions. So, Sir Louis, take it away.
Thank you so much, Father Albert. I want to begin by thanking Dr. Deborah Tonelli for her tireless work for ensuring that this discussion would occur. It's taken a long time to get here, but we're really grateful for her perseverance. So yes, this presentation is more on the peace study side of things, and I know these are interconnected dimensions because, as the previous presenters mentioned, if we're in contexts of violence, which I'm in the United States, I'm in Chicago, so if we're following international events, we're actually north of Chicago, so we're not on the front lines of what's happening, but we're increasingly in that context as well. So what do we do if we're committed to peace, committed to nonviolence, have a vision that it could be different than what it is? So by way of background on my chapter, which is titled Visions of Great Peace, Thinking Through Chinese Religions on Personal and Socio-Political Harmony. So as Father Albert mentioned, it's chapter 1 in Exiting Violence, which is quite interesting because my chapters are almost always last in edited volumes. So it was like a pleasant surprise to say, oh, my chapter's first. So my friend and colleague, Jared Mannion, initially asked me to speak on Chinese religions more generally. So as Father Albert mentioned, I'm a specialist on Taoism. That's what I work on. So what Jared wanted was a kind of more general account for, I think, both the conference attendees, but also potentially the edited volume audience who might not be as familiar with Chinese religions. So thinking about, rather than a kind of hyper-specialist study, which I could do, and if you look at the chapter, some of it is really hyper-specialized in terms of Taoist studies, but what it'd be like to present a broader kind of view of Chinese religion. So that's what it became. As I mentioned, I'm a specialist in Taoism, but trained in religious studies. So this is how I think about things. Most scholars of Taoism are trained in sinology. I'm obviously trained in sinology because there's no way to be a scholar of Taoism without that. But it's really coming at it from a religious studies perspective, thinking about a lot of the perspectives that's been brought up, both different religious traditions, but also theoretical and methodological issues. So as I said, unlike a lot of the other contributors, I wasn't really writing from a hyper-specialized or ultra-specialized perspective. It was a broader, more generalized perspective, a comparative perspective, which is not my normal way of doing scholarship. So just to give you a context, like if you read the chapter, it's quite different than a lot of the other things that I've done. But as I said, this was primarily requested on Jared's part because he was assuming less familiarity with Chinese religions on the part of the readers. So the primary focus of the chapter is the key indigenous Chinese concern with Taiping, or Great Peace. This refers to an ideal, an aspiration for socio-political harmony in which all members of society may flourish. So this is key, right? This is the framework of the chapter. If we imagine that kind of possibility, right, it doesn't exist, but if we imagine it, what would it look like? And so you have different views of that, you have different approaches to that in the history of Chinese religions. And in this context, it's especially important to recognize that it was the namesake, so that is Taiping, of a Taoist movement. And this Taoist movement was emerging basically in the later part of the Eastern Han Dynasty. And this represents a key watershed moment in Taoist history in the mid to late 2nd century CE. But as Dr. Reeder mentioned, it's odd because this actually was a millennial movement or some kind of quasi-millennial movement that actually engaged in rebellion against the Han state. So it was partly responsible for the collapse of the Han government, of the indigenous Chinese government. It's also what allowed for another movement that you may or may not know, the Tianchi, the Celestial Masters movement that emerged in the state of Shu, so in kind of southwest China, so modern Sichuan. And so we're thinking about that relationship of there's a vision of great peace, but then there's ultra violence that comes along with it. So what do we do with that fact? Do you have to actually engage in revolutionary activity in order to instigate, as Dr. Reeder said, in order to instigate a Taoist theocracy? Like, okay, this seems contradictory. But part of what I'm trying to explore in this particular chapter and also in this presentation is, what is the vision? What is the vision behind it? So maybe the Taoist Taiping, the Taoist Great Peace Movement doesn't actually represent this, you know? So there's that kind of tension in Chinese history. But for the chapter, I looked at a variety of examples with a subtext, and this is really important for this conversation. The subtext was contemporary relevance for more viable models for human being and relationality, especially for overcoming violence and working towards a more peaceful and harmonious society. So the first piece of the chapter looks at the harmony of the three teachings. So if you know Chinese religions, this is oftentimes kind of put forward as a distinctive kind of representative aspect of Chinese religion. So San Jiao He Yi. In Western language publications, oftentimes talk about as Chinese syncretism, quote unquote. But the way I tend to look at it is it's more about cross-pollination. It's more about religious interaction, the way that religious traditions adapt and develop in relationship to each other, and oftentimes in dialogue with each other. So there's some very clear examples and maybe counterexamples for some of the previous presentations of interreligious dialogue that was based in kind of mutual respect and mutual flourishing, and the recognition that each one could potentially benefit from the other's perspective. And Taoism, especially medieval Taoism, is very clear on this because Taoism becomes radically altered through Buddhist influence. You know, I think in really positive ways. So one of the ways that gets altered is, sorry, I should speak a little more slowly. One of the ways it becomes altered is there's a Mahayana Buddhist influence, right? Based upon the idea of kind of universal salvation, compassion for all beings, these kinds of things that Taoists oftentimes are not really paying attention to. You know, and that would be an example of Taoists taking Buddhism seriously, the challenge of Buddhism on that level. Like, well, you say you care about all beings, but are you actually, is your tradition based upon that kind of concern? So there's a Mahayana Buddhist infusion of Taoism. That's just an example. But in this aspect of the harmony of the three teachings, there's this recognition that so-called Confucianism, so usually like in a decolonial move, we talk about this as Ruism, but whatever, Ruism or so-called Confucianism, Buddhism and Taoism as the so-called three teachings, the San Jiao, could be harmonized. They were like, could be, you know, mutually resonant. They could be combined in this way that most Chinese people in kind of pre-modern China and traditional Chinese culture would think that they're all relevant on some level for their daily lives. So that doesn't diminish their distinctness as traditions, but it's talking about the way that it's lived, the way that it's practiced on the ground. So that is, there would be a lot of what we might call Taoist sympathizers, but fewer Taoist adherents or fewer Taoist affiliates. There still were Taoist affiliates, but the majority of people are kind of thinking themselves as having maybe multiple religious identities. So one of the points here for us in this conversation is that this opens up the possibility of interreligious dialogue. What is it like to really be open to other people's perspectives and to allow that to transform our perspectives in positive ways? So Dr. Reeder was talking about potential in negative ways, and that's true too, but are there other possibilities here? The second part was looking at Indra's jeweled net and the question of interdependence. So that might be less familiar to a lot of people. But this comes out of a relatively obscure Chinese Buddhist movement called Huayan, or flower garland Buddhism. What flower garland Buddhism is talking about is the possibility of enlightenment and what reality looks like from the perspective of enlightenment. So the name derives from the Avatamsaka Sutra, which is translated into Chinese as the Huayan Jing, so the flower garland sutra. And according to Huayan Buddhism, this sutra is describing ultimate enlightenment, right? So of course, you have to kind of look at this contextually, that there are different Chinese schools of Mahayana Buddhism. This is one of them. So this is how Huayan Buddhism positioned itself in the larger landscape of Chinese Buddhism. But the claim was that if you read the Avatamsaka Sutra, if you understood its teachings, you would understand what reality was, what reality looks like from the point of view of the Buddha's enlightenment. That's what the text represents. One of the key passages in this is the passage on the jeweled net of Indra. And the jeweled net of Indra is the vision of the cosmos and reality as a net with all of these different nodes that consist of multifaceted jewels. And each jewel reflects all of the other jewels. So this is the vision of enlightenment. Right? That is, you are a particular node, you are a particular jewel in Indra's jeweled net, but you also see all of the other jewels, like to infinity, reflected. So it's a vision of interdependence, and I think in this context, it's also a vision for multi-perspectivalism. Rather than assuming our position at the node that we're in, what is it like to understand we're in an interconnected net, and to understand each jewel reflecting different jewels, reflecting different parts of the net, different aspects of reality. So there are a lot of other analogies that we can use. Another part of the chapter, and I think this is especially relevant for the question of violence and how do we engage violence or think about violence, is looking at great learning and the question of embedded relationality. So this is coming out of Ruism, or so-called Confucianism, and especially late medieval, what's called Da Shui, so way learning. In English, it's often referred to with the problematic name of Neo-Confucianism. That doesn't translate what it's talking about. Da Shui is the indigenous name, so thinking about this indigenous decolonial perspective. So, right, it tells us something important about the movement. It's studying the Tao, it's studying the way, it's studying what reality is. So there's, again, a Taoist influence, also a Chan Buddhist influence, so there are many layers to this movement. But one of the really interesting things about it is there's a question of how do we become fully human? So from a Ruist perspective, this involves moral cultivation and cultural refinement. And in this chapter, the Da Shui chapter, the Great Learning chapter, which is chapter 42 of the Li Ji, the Book of Rites, there's an understanding of how we go about doing this kind of cultivation in a more cosmocentric way. So first is the cultivation of the person. Second is the cultivation of the family. Third is the cultivation of society. Fourth, the world. And fifth, the cosmos. So going back to the previous point, this is a grassroots activism, if you want to understand in more contemporary terms. I don't like the way the world is. Well, what are you cultivating? I'm cultivating violence, right? That's why you encounter a violent world. So that doesn't mean that's the whole story. But the great learning perspective, and this also comes out of influence, in terms of it feeds into Taoism, there's a lot of cross-pollination, but there's a very strong, I think, sense in traditional Chinese culture about self-cultivation. That's where it starts. So if you start with the family and you don't say, well, the family is composed of these different members, what are these different members cultivating? The family won't be harmonious. Most people, right, especially when you think about social engagement, I'm aware of the time, I have about one more minute of talking. When you think about the larger society, people, well, okay, thanks, Father Albert. You give me a couple more minutes. When you think of the larger society, and especially social engagement, social activism, it tends to be global, right? That's where people start. It's like, this isn't going to work. It's like too massive of a scale. So what's interesting about the Great Learning chapter is it changes the scale to the individual, but the individual in embedded relationality. So it's not individualistic. It's only the individual is the ground of the family. So who are those individuals that make up each family? Those families are the ground of what makes up society. So how do they all fit together and what are they cultivating? And again, I alluded to what's going on in the United States. Well, it's quite clear that the majority of people involved in this, what I would call an apocalyptic, zombie apocalyptic army that's emerging, is this sense of like there's a lack of cultivation in this sense, right? So the claim of what's being made, this is why we're doing this, is radically different from the actual value system. So if you look at it from this Ruist perspective, it's okay, what are the actual values? The values being cultivated, not the rhetoric, because the rhetoric is completely different. And again, I don't know how much people are following this. So the last part of the chapter is really talking about a Taoist view of this that's related to sacred being and shared animality, and this relates to the idea of the theology. How do we theologize this? And the Taoist theology is really a kind of embodied, embedded theology that's not just the human, it's the animal. It's the way in which there is this shared animality, and that shared animality is a sacred reality. So in the interest of time, I won't go through all of the Taoist views of the Tao, but what this really is talking about embodied being in the world, and it overlaps with animal studies. So what this leads to in the chapter, and this is the more radical part, and I won't go into it here because I think it will probably create a fair amount of discomfort, at least among some people, is the possibility of a bloodless mythology. And this is coming out of Taoism. So going back to some of the previous points, it's like, how are people actually participating in a system of violence? And if you go back to the animal point, there's a whole underground dimension of this that people are participating in. So how much is this structural? And if you know the later Derrida actually touched upon this too, although my thinking was independent of Derrida. It was pointed out to me by another colleague. So there's a theology of blood in this. And Taoists have a very particular view that if blood is involved, you're participating in some kind of structural issue that needs to be overcome. So the Taoist vision is a bloodless theology. It's the possibility that we can actually become separate from or disengage from what I tend to call the military-industrial prison slaughterhouse complex. So you probably heard the first two. I don't know if you've heard the third. In the United States, prisons are being put forward very strongly as connected to the previous two, but almost no one's talking about the slaughterhouse connection. So how do we kind of confront that? So then lastly, thinking through this, what are we cultivating and what are we embodying? How are we enacting our values? Is there a possibility of living our values in relationship to some kind of beneficial and transformational influence on the possibility of peace? So that's part of the vision of great peace. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sir Louis. That's a mouthful. Now, I don't want to waste time. I'd like to invite the speakers. Can you engage among yourselves? Maybe Ian would have a question to Louis, and Louis to Ian, and Vincent to Louis. You know,
Yeah.
like for example, can the Vincent's context be used to legitimate violence in the sense of Ian's presentation? And from all this discussion on conflict, how do we derive peace?
Yeah.
Beyond
Can I
text? That's right. So just
can
a
I
few
ask,
minutes. you interact with each other.
Okay, can I go, Louis, I was looking at your chapter earlier on, you raised that question about passivism, perpetuating, potentially. I mean, when you were talking about the kind of issue of self-cultivation, one of the concerns I have there, because this is a sort of theme that comes out a lot in a lot of Japanese more new religious movements. And what it tends to do is, certainly Japan, is kind of lead to a disengagement from social issues and problems, you know. And in fact, interestingly, in a sense, it also, when I was interviewing members of Aum Shinrikyo, not that weren't at the highest level, who weren't involved in the actual violence of the movement, they were kind of passively, tacitly complicit in it. And when I asked, you know, I would constantly ask them, weren't you concerned? Didn't you feel you were contributing to the emerging culture of violence, which then became involved killing people outside the movement? And they constantly kept saying to me, and in Japanese they use the term jibun no shugya, I was doing my own practice. And that was what was important. I was changing the world through myself. And yet that seemed to me actually to tacitly almost not just condone violence, but effectively open the door, because it meant that within that particular movement, there was no resistance. Anybody who might have resisted said, saying, no, I'm doing my own practice. And that kind of, my concern about issues like self-cultivation is precisely that theme of internalization, which then makes you not look outwards. I mean, and I might also be expressing there my frustration with friends here who get politically engaged and come on the barricades with me.
Yes, I think escapism is a quite real issue, you know, and so but I think the other part, and this connects to both of your talks, is the social location. So how are people socially situated, you know? And one part of me thinks about the larger patterns of Chinese history and also how I'm located now. That is, I think there's also an ascetic renunciant response, which is a rejection of participation in mainstream society. I mean, so if you look at, again, not to belabor what's going on in modern America, but I mean, it's at hand, it's not even at hand, it's on our doorsteps where I'm located, is what do you do with a completely degenerate socio-political order, right? I mean, all of these protests going on in the United States are, I mean, this is like futile in terms of what the government is actually doing. So I think there's a real question of like, what is the most effective form of resistance? And might the resistance look like radically different? So in the case of Taoism, you definitely have grassroots communities that are resisting in different ways. So some of those resistance points are creating theocratic states. And as I said, but then you have these very complicated historical patterns, because one of the reasons that the Celestial Masters were able to create a theocratic state in Sichuan and Southwest China is because another Taoist movement in Northeast China helped collapse the government. So it's like, well, then there's this embedded interconnected relationship. But I think the other part of this that's important, so besides the social situatedness of it all, is thinking about, yes, like how are they actually socially engaged? So who's looking at it, and that, again, the kind of value system. So one part of, I think, what I was trying to point to in the chapter is there is this sense, I think, in most of the examples that I gave of the self-cultivation, it cannot be egoic. It cannot be the sense that you are isolated, which is partly what I was bringing up the animal question. And I know for some people that will probably be a source of discomfort. But the animal question, how are we embedded in this? As you said, I think even complicit or implicated in it. So one of the things I think about, and then I'll stop because I don't want to take too much of our time, but I think about this a lot with, I tend, when I was teaching undergraduates, although now I'm teaching a class for graduate students on contemplative studies, I think a lot about the Religious Society of Friends, the Quakers, right? So this Protestant Christian denomination that is a historic peace church. And they tend to be obviously on the nonviolent side, but even the pacifist side. But do you need a militaristic government like the United States to actually enable you to be a pacifist church, right? I mean, who's protecting you from the rest of the things that could happen? So I do think there are a lot of these deeper ethical issues with what are you dependent on if you're doing this kind of thing like self-cultivation. You know, are you reliant upon some kind of like larger social protection that's rooted in violence? So you're not directly participating in the violence, but you're implicated in it, you're complicit in it by how you're positioned. So.
Okay, thank you very much. That's a big question. Vincent?
See, I would say that there is no political solution for, containing violence. At least in India, from Indian perspectives, it is usually the theological and certain philosophical thoughts and concepts that help us actually to understand the interdependence or providing space for the other, for interreligious or intersocial community dialogue and all those things. I don't think, see, politics and political leaders, they have their own agenda. So they have to, say, occupy the positions and they have to earn money. And their focus and everything is very, very different. So they have to rule first. And probably exploit the people, especially the downtrodden people. So, but what actually will help us bring communities, I mean, cultural communities or religious communities together is certain value system that is embedded in scriptures, whether it is Taoist scripture or Hindu scripture or Christian Bible or any of these things. Of course, the scriptures is very, very important, especially who uses the scripture in what context. You see, scriptures are used sometimes very selectively, sometimes for their own benefit, for the group benefit. So, see, one day I was talking to one Buddhist monk with no hurts to any Buddhist who is here. I was talking to one Buddhist monk in Sri Lanka, and he belonged to one particular radical group. And then I asked him, why you people are so violent? And then you know what he said? It was really surprising, and to me it was shocking. He said, you see, in our scriptures, we believe in a bodhisattva who is a kind of would-be Buddha. But the thing is, he forgoes his own liberation, his own salvation, so that he may send all others to heaven, all others to liberation. So he is the bodhisattva, which means he is a radicalist, and he has to defend people, he has to fight for people, and then we are actually modeled on that bodhisattva ideal. It is coming from the scriptures, Mahayana's texts, you see. And then you see in India also, you have certain Hindu texts are there that discriminates, for instance, women, that discriminates the lower caste people, not lower caste, but the thing lower class people made into a caste afterwards. But the thing is, is completely very discriminatory in its perspectives. Now, who uses these scriptures for what purpose? So you see, actually, these liberation theologians, for instance, especially in India, when it became very, very popular, they made use of certain texts, especially the prophets. The prophets actually, who were actually standing in the place of God, for God to speak against the kings and others in order to liberate people. So you have certain texts that is being used by theologians, especially with regard to the active service, with regard to the poor, the Adivasi, Dalits, and all those things in India. Even now, we make use of such texts because they are very, very helpful. But you know, the Jain studies, I have done something, and then it tells you, for instance, a thing called cultivating a plural perspectives. It is usually known as anekantavada. Not ekanta is just single, but anekanta means many, plural perspectives. Especially in India, the Christians over the years have started understanding a plural perspective on the concept of God. God can be present in so many ways in history. He can express himself in so many ways in history. It has taken long time actually to understand these things. So it is something very, very interesting, because this plural perspective, especially on the perception of God in India, it certainly brings together Hindu and Christian communities. So it is very important, because you know very well that Swami Vivekananda, who is a Doyen and then who came to America in 1892, 93, and then he preached and then went about several places establishing Advaita Vedanta system. And he says that it is like God is like rivers. It can go in crooked places and he can go in a straight path, and finally it reaches some place like that. He was actually meaning that Hindus are not really finding it really difficult in accepting many gods. You know, it is in earlier times, and especially the Portuguese missionaries who came to India in the beginning, and several other missionaries, they have made a kind of, I can say it, they have made derogatory statements, comments on Hindus and their beliefs, and especially on gods and all those things. I don't need to feel ashamed to say this.
Yeah, Vincent, sorry to interrupt. We only have a little bit of time left, so I think maybe we should open it up to the chat. I think there was a question.
So cultivating a kind of a plural perspective certainly brings people together.
Unfortunately, the audience do not have access to sending questions, but we got one somehow.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
I've been reading it, and it seems
You've
to be
read it.
addressed to me. Yeah.
It's addressed to you, Ian Reader, but I think this applies to most of us, the speakers. So abuse is a word that can be used to describe any authority and kind of interpretation, hermeneutics, implicitly, that tends to interpret a given text whose content is deemed sacred for personal or community favor. In other words, there's lots of conflict. We're looking for peace. We run to sacred text, but then we realize sacred text also has provisions for legitimizing conflict. Where do we go?
Yeah. I mean, the first thing to say is, I mean, the trouble with the word abuse in itself is that it's so often used to avoid the problem. I mean, I was thinking back, you know, when you go back even to 9/11 or something, you then get people saying, this is an abuse of religion, as if to say, not the problem, you know, and we often use that term of abuse, the way of trying to kind of evade or get around the problem, that it's right there in, you know, these issues to do with violence might be right there in texts. And I think there needs to be a lot more kind of focus on questioning of why, you know, why so many texts say things in the way that they do. And maybe particularly now we're in a different age from when so many of them written, a more serious questioning of them as a way of saying, well, do we need those texts anymore? I think that is a highly critical issue. I mean, unless we unless we kind of confront that point and say, for example, well, in this Buddhist suit, in this Buddhist text that's significant in Sri Lanka, that is not helpful for the present day. Unless we do things like that, I think we're going to be caught in a recurrent cycle of problematics in which texts aren't being abused, but they are being just interpreted in a particular way.
So it appears that there's lots of conflict, and religion with sacred text could be a source of legitimizing this conflict, but you cannot conclude just do away with all religion. Have the patience to discover the possibilities or peace that is also embedded in sacred text. But I'd like to throw one question which is not to be answered. I also discovered in my context that between the Muslims and Christianity, they neglect the indigenous peoples. I asked the bishops and the ustads, and they said, well, we cannot ask them to join our dialogue because they do not have sacred text. Oh, so aside from interpreting text, the lack of sacred text, the lack of scriptures could also be used against some sectors of society. So we need to be patient and discover how else we can make use of the possibilities for peace from sacred text, at the same time aware that even non-textual religions could be a source of peace as well. Now, Deborah, I think you'll need some few seconds to say thank you to the participants.
Thank you very much. I am really happy for this very stimulating and interesting conversation. Gerard Mannion would be also very happy for this and to see the continuation of the debate, the discussion on these very, very important issues and challenges. And you really highlighted the complexity of so important issues, providing us important tools to understand not only the complexity, but also the dynamics and the importance to change our perspective in approaching different cultures, different traditions, overcoming prejudice, and trying to build bridges to increase the dialogue and understanding. So thank you very much. I thanks also our audience to join us, and see you in the next webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.